Good afternoon and welcome everyone. So my name's John T. Heversedge. I'm the chair of the South East London CCG, and you are very welcome to our AGM. I'm not going to say a lot by way of introduction, I guess, other than to recognise that this is quite an unusual time and in many ways quite an unusual annual general meeting because of that. There have been such significant changes taking place both to the CCG, and we'll come on to talk about those, but also to our lives and to the way in which health services are being delivered across South East London, that having a conversation at this point about last year will inevitably seem a little bit strange and slightly disconnected from the very real challenges that we're facing at the moment, that we will of course come on to talk about in our governing body meeting following this. But it is important, I think, that we do have the opportunity to reflect on the successes of last year, some of the challenges that we faced, that we absolutely in public talk about the work that we have been doing and how we have been spending public money, and that's incredibly important as an organisation, and that we also look forward and think about some of the particular challenges and opportunities that there are going forward as well. So that's really the intention of the next hour. We will hear from Andrew Bland as the accountable officer, and Usman will take us through some of the financial reporting. I'll then reflect briefly on the coming year, and I hope we'll have good time for public questions if you have any. So on that note, I will hand over to Andrew, who will review the 2019-20 year. Thanks, Andrew. You're on mute, I think, Andrew.
Bad start. My apologies. As Johnny said, my name is Andrew Bland. I'm the accountable officer for the CCG. Not to add any complexity to it, but for the year we're talking about, I was the accountable officer for the 6 CCGs most of the time, and I think to be clear, throughout the year in question, accountable officer for 5 of the 6 CCGs throughout, and then midway through that year I became the accountable officer for NHS Lambeth CCG. So just because we're talking about a pre-merged organisation. And I'm the Integrated Care System Lead for South East London, a partnership with all of our sovereign bodies, provider, commissioner and local government, working together for our population. As Jonty said, the year in question is unique in many ways, and we'll reflect on some of that, no doubt, throughout this hour and in our governing body later on today. And I wanted to make sure we mark some of the things that have caused us real challenges, as Jonty has said, but not forget some of the real achievements that the organisations were able to put forward. So I wonder if I might go to the first slide in that spirit, if you like. So the overall highlight seat to pick this out, but an obvious thing to say is that for the entirety of the year in question, we undertook an engagement process for the first half of the year, and in truth, a bit of the year before that, around the future of commissioning organisations in South East London, so our CCGs as were. And the upshot of that was on the 1st of April, we established a new CCG. As a result, we disestablished the previous 6 and became an organisation known as NHS South East London CCG. So for our 1.92 million residents, we commission those services. I think I'm right to say, actually, at the moment, we are not one of the biggest, we are the biggest CCG in the country. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why we thought it was important to make that change. In short, we celebrated rightly, I think, the work of our CCGs, the clinical leaders that lead them throughout our time since 2013 onwards. What we wanted to do for Emerger was enact some changes that allowed us to take decisions at different population levels that we felt would be important. And so in merging the CCG, our prime focus was to retain very local presence, actually, and we've established borough-based boards and ways of continuing to take decisions at borough level and in truth sub-borough level where that's appropriate. But we wanted that additional ability to be able to take decisions once across South East London. not least because our residents move across our boroughs for a large number of their services, particularly when they involve acute care. So we want to be able to do that. However, we didn't fancy a change. We had a couple of other really important goals to achieve through the merger of CCGs. And the second one is tangential but really important, so that we did want to be able to organise our resources in a way that were closer to local government. And so, yes, it's true, we have merged the CCG. In doing so, we've established local teams that are more conjoined or integrated with local government commissioners than ever before. In some boroughs, that is long-standing, and others it's newer, but across the piece, we've enhanced that. I'm very pleased to say that. And a number of joint appointments have come about in each borough because of that. 4 of our 6 boroughs have a single individual accountable to both myself in the CCG or the health service, but also to the local government chief executive officer. That join up feeling really important. And we also wanted to be able to work with our providers in a different way. And anybody who is joining our governing body later on today will hear from the Acute Provider Collaborative. And we are working hand in glove now with multiple organisations, working differently in partnership to achieve things rather than in silos. So we merged our CCG. We were one of 3 mergers in the capital. And I'm very grateful and thank people for the work they put into getting there. We did, of course, close out the year, and it's been the story ever since, asking our teams to respond with all of our partners and local residents to the pandemic outbreak. And of course, that occurred was the focus of our attention throughout the last quarter of the year in question, and relentlessly so ever since. Our governing bodies in public since April have picked up in detail some of our responses there, and we will do that again today. What I wanted to use this opportunity to do is place on record my thanks to our staff and our leaders, clinical and otherwise, for the flexibility and a huge effort they'd placed into that pandemic response in a partnership basis. We have had CCG staff working in all manner of different contexts to make sure that we place the pandemic response at the forefront of our efforts. Some of our staff have worked in our local hospitals or in general practices, setting up and coordinating new services. They have organised PPE to provide additional resource where it was required, and doing so with a moment's notice and significant effect. I can see Usman on my screen. I wasn't planning to thank him with his face up. I don't know if we've got the presentation back, but thank you, Usman, as well. I'll continue. If the presentation can come back, that'd be really handy. Thank you. And then within the pandemic response, of course, we have had the tragedy of a huge number of our local residents who have either had COVID and it's impacted on their and their families' lives, or indeed, unfortunately, have died during the pandemic. And so we will take a moment to reflect on that, as we do most days, actually. And we are now preparing ourselves for whatever the pandemic may hold going forward. I want to place particular thanks to our colleagues that we have called Gold Command for the CCG. So Angela Barnes, Sarah Cottingham, Christina Windell and Kate Moratti-Baker, who have met 3 times a day, pretty much every day, and for large parts of the period, 7 days a week, to coordinate our response and make sure that we are looking after our staff, but equally directing them in such a way that we're making a difference to that pandemic response. So I particularly thank those individuals for leading our programme across all parts of our organisation. We became the first of a partnership in London to become an integrated care system. I wasn't particularly going to dwell on this, except to say some of the unique features of our application were not that we had resolved all partnership matters, and were not that we could offer up compliance with our financial obligations or performance in A&E or wait times, wherever it may be, but that we were considered to be a partnership with the potential to go further and faster than other people. And I hope that we are going to build on that arrangement. Our integrated care system is a partnership across 6 local authorities, now 1 CCG, our NHS providers and wider provision in the system, all with a focus on the population. And I look forward to us sort of taking that work forward going thereafter. I don't think it's, I was going to say it feels like old news, but of course it's very relevant news now. We will be taking our next steps in EU exit planning, although I understand we have technically exited, but this was a large part of, we look back at the financial year that we are talking about, and I think we had stood up and had in place excellent arrangements to manage any impact of a no deal or other exit strategy from the European Union. So my thanks again to the staff who put heart and soul into that work. And then of course we introduced some new organisations into our system, or in truth new partnerships of existing organisations. Our 212 general practices across South East London forms 35 partnerships or networks, a new way of working that goes beyond general practice and speaks to the whole range of professionals that should come together around neighbourhood populations. We have this theme now, a transition of looking at our neighbourhoods, populations of 50,000, our boroughs in hand in glove with local governments that serve them, and across South East London for some areas of care. And then finally, and of course, this has now been amplified by international events, and of course by the pandemic, for those things that we are now focusing on around equality and diversity. More on that for those who can join the governing body later. I will speed up, Chair, but I wanted to dwell on that, sort of highlight and overview. Just next slide, if that's okay, Simon. I'll call out just a couple of things on each of these slides, and hopefully they are up long enough for people to get a feel for where we are. But essentially, we have clearly dealt with a huge number of challenges, as the health service have, as a South East Londoners, over the period we're talking about. I don't want us to miss some of these achievements. The highest rate of flu vaccination in London is actually a bit more significant than it sounds. The population and the way it moves and changes in London means that being able to achieve what Bromley has achieved in our system, to me, is extra specially good. That's the most inventive word I can come up with, is excellence for flu vaccination. Across the borders into Lambeth, our special needs and special education needs see that borough in the top 30% in the country. Our diabetes performance, which I think is actually the product of a decade's worth of working, probably longer, has left us in some of the strongest positions relative to other parts of the country, right here in South East London. Particularly pleased to be able to call out the praise our teams have received for engagement with local people. It's a real clear priority for all of our CCGs and the new CCG, and to have not just one but all of our CCGs with the highest 2 ratings and 3 of them in the excellent category, I think left us best in the country. And then good financial performance across the piece, and we're used to celebrating strong financial performance in South East London CCGs, plural. I really wanted to call out the work in Bexley and Greenwich. So that moved those organisations from quite a challenged position to one of stability for the future, and a huge amount of efforts, yes, with our finance teams, but across the piece to achieve that. Simon, can I go to the next slide, please? Service improvements, a slightly different take on the same issues. I won't read these slides out. I did want to just focus on perhaps the state and digital innovation or newness in South East London. For those of you involved in what was Dulwich Hospital and is now the Tessagel Health Centre, that isn't a celebration of work over the last 12-18 months, but more like 12-18 years, and probably longer in truth. So the idea we'll have the type of facility we're enjoying now is fantastic. Likewise, developments in Lambeth, and of course in Bexley, we are, I don't want to use the word world beating in this context, but certainly pushing towards some of the best offerings for online consultations, the e-hub for Bexley residents. And of course, if we can move to primary care, which I will end on. Actually, I've talked about primary care networks and a new way of working, but in the wider primary care system, what we have been in a position, thank you to colleagues in general practice, but also those who supported them, where our CQC ratings, where they haven't been as good as we'd have wished, have consistently gone up through hard work and action to pay attention to where we are. In Lewisham, Pride in Practice has taken hold, and with a large number of the practices involved. And then, of course, Clinical Effectiveness Southwark shortlisted for awards, rightly so, in terms of innovation we're putting forward. And again, we see that in some of our work down in Bromley. The final slide is just a summary slide, and rather than do anything other than leave you to read it, I just want to express my personal thanks for staff, the people we work with, our partners, and the residents we work for, and your engagement with us that's allowed us to ring up a number of achievements of which I'm enormously proud, and I hope you are as well, in a time that has felt extraordinarily challenging. And there's no getting away from that. Chair, I'll stop there, but I hope that gives us a bit of a flavour for how the year looked.
Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate that, and it is important that we spend time reflecting on the fantastic work that's been going on across South East London. I'm going to hand over now to Osman just to say a little more about some of the the finances over the last year.
Thank you, Jonty. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Osman Niazi. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the South East London CCG. I should say, like Andrew, given that we're talking about 1920, I was the CFO for the CCGs, for 5 of the CCGs from all of last year, and I took on the role for Lambeth partway through the year. So just to sort of summarise, Simon, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I think the top line there sort of says, in accordance with the National Year-End Timetable, we did all our accounts. I think that masks some of the difficulties that we had in doing that. I think it would be remiss of me not to say that clearly during the pandemic and the sort of our response to the COVID crisis, that was the priority and that was the focus. But I just wanted to express my thanks to the whole finance team and others for the fact that, despite the fact we were in lockdown, staff were all at home, the whole finance team managed to do all of the work needed to do for our annual accounts, and we submitted everything on time. And so just to express my thanks to them. You'll see there from the table that we had set a control total for the overall all 6 CCGs of 3.6 million. And I'm pleased to say that all 6 of our CCGs not just delivered a control total, but we were slightly better than control total. So about £400,000 better than the control total we've been set at the start of the year. And on the next slide, sorry, Simon, you just see a little bit of the detail of some of the statutory duties that we're also obligated to make. And I think it's just worth highlighting some of those. So not only did we deliver all our control totals, but we stayed within our cash drawdown limits. We stayed within our running cost allowance, and I'll come on to that just at the end briefly again. And I think importantly, we don't always focus on this, but we also made sure that we paid all our suppliers within the requisite time. And I think just sort of thinking about COVID, especially some of the smaller organisations we work with, the voluntary care sector, and some of the NGO, some of the local government sort of links that we have with some of those sectors, it was important to us that we made sure that we paid all of those small providers in particular to make sure they had some support in the early parts of the pandemic that were in March. So overall, it was a really good performance from all 6 CCGs. We received, you'll note there, for Bexley, the £7.5 million of Commissioner's Sustainability funding. So just as a reminder, Bexley CCG did originally have a deficit plan, but if we'd achieved a deficit of £7.5 million, which is a really significant improvement on where the CCG was in the previous year, we received and were able to receive the full value of the CSF so that that CCG could report break even. So I think, again, I just want to express thanks to colleagues in Bexley, because it wasn't just a finance team effort, it was the whole organisation, clinicians, operational teams, management teams, all working together to help deliver that. And I think it hopefully sets us up well as we become a single CCG now, starting from a sustainable financial position as we move into future years. If we go on to the next slide, so just to say in terms of our accounts, so we submitted the accounts on time. I'm really pleased to say that all of our CCGs received unqualified opinions. which, if you're a bit of a geek like me in accounting terms, is a really good thing, and hopefully gives assurance to all that we've done everything appropriately and properly, and that we've ensured that we had good use of our resources and that we provided value for money. I won't go through all the detail on those, the rest of those sort of statements, but I think it's just, again, worth highlighting that we had regulatory opinions that said that the CCG's income and expenditure position was accurate and correct, that we satisfied all our value for money perspectives, and that we received, as I said, unqualified opinions for all of our accounts. And then I suppose just before, there's a couple of bits that I'll just add at the end, but just this slide sets out where we spend our money. It'll be familiar to most people, but I think it is just worth highlighting on that out of almost £3 billion budget, we did only spend 1% of that on our running costs, and that 99% of what we spend goes on patient and clinical services for our local residents. And I think it's just worth highlighting that. And sort of, I think, expresses thanks to sort of the efficiency with which all our teams operate. So that's sort of just a brief summary of what we did in 1920, just from the sort of annual accounts perspective. I think it's worth mentioning also that, as Andrew said, we went through a really significant structural change last year in terms of merging the CCGs, and it's not always something we talk about, but as well as all the sort of bringing together the teams, we also had to spend a lot of work bringing together all the financial systems and implementing a single sort of financial environment and ledger for the new CCG. And again, I just really wanted to express my thanks to the finance team for all the work they did. I think it's worth noting that our internal auditors specifically commented on the high quality work that had been done in order to get that merger done. And as I said, the end of that process was at the height of the COVID crisis, and a lot of that was being done remotely by the team. So the fact that we managed to get it all done on time with no issues, all staff got paid, all our suppliers were paid as a new organisation, was a really good achievement. It's a bit of a brief canter through, Jonty, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Osman. That's fantastic. I just wanted to, before we open up to questions from the public, I just wanted to touch on a bit of a forward look. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. In many ways, what Andrew and Usman have already touched upon inevitably are some of the changes that have been taking place since April in relation to the new CCG and to our work within the system as a partner in the ICS. But I wonder whether we could take a couple of slides on this. So Simon, would you just forward the slide for me? Thank you. That's great. And we will, by the way, ensure that this slide deck is available to people following the meeting as well. I know that people are asking about that, so we'll ensure that that is the case. So I think really, as Andrew and Usman have already mentioned, we have been a merged organisation since the 1st of April. And I think from my point of view, I just wanted to reflect on the reasons behind that. And I hope that as time moves on, we will start to be able to demonstrate the value in coming together, not simply because we wanted to be a more efficient organisation, although inevitably that is a part of it, but actually so that we could be more responsive to the communities in South East London by being able to work at, if you like, a different sort of spatial level, reflecting the different sorts of work that we need to do as an organisation. Part of our work is absolutely about having a very deep understanding and engagement with local communities. But equally, it's about working with the acute providers across South East London, to ensure that the services that they deliver to residents in all of our boroughs are of the highest possible standard. So I think there's something about the way in which we work reflecting the need to be able to be both big and small at the same time. And that's what we're trying to achieve through the merger and through the ways of working that we are starting to establish as an organisation. That should allow us to start to integrate care and services, so start to ensure that people have a much more seamless experience of care, and it should put us in a position where we can work much more collaboratively with partners across the system. And in particular, Andrew has mentioned the Acute Provider Collaborative, and we're going to hear from Clive Kay in the governing body meeting following this. But it's really important that actually we begin to work much more closely with providers across South East London, so that the traditional separation that has existed between commissioners who pay for care and those who provide care starts to narrow, and we start to think collectively about how we take responsibility for the cost and the care of the whole population, and we do so, as I say, in a meaningful way that ensures that we can have those deep connections into local boroughs as well. And I wanted to flag those borough relationships because actually that, certainly our experience of the response to COVID has demonstrated why in that first phase that borough working was so critical, where we needed to respond to some of the most vulnerable patients in our community. It was really through those local relationships that the local authority colleagues, general practice, the voluntary and community sector, community services were all able to come together and wrap services around the most vulnerable in our community. So I think that acted as a great demonstration of why we have to have those very, very strong foundations as an organisation at borough level. And there's an absolute commitment to continuing to do that, whilst deepening our relationships, of course, across South East London more broadly as well. So, Simon, if you could just move on to the next slide. I did just briefly want to sort of reflect on the progress that there has been as we have come together as a single organisation. Again, this reflects much of what Andrew has already spoken of, but I suppose what, from my point of view, I was incredibly proud of over the last few months was the extent to which we absolutely put our role as commissioners to some extent to one side to think about how we could support the rest of the system, how we could help to coordinate the response to COVID, but also how we could support staff within the organisation. Andrew mentioned people being redeployed, but we also obviously had to bring staff through a significant change in terms of the organisation as well. And it's incredibly important that we continue to think about how we provide support to staff. It's a very unusual time and there are very, very new ways of working. The fact that we are having this conversation online in this way reflects the way in which we're having to work quite often. And one of the things that's been incredibly important is to think about staff well-being through this process of significant change, both in relation to the pandemic, but also to the changes that have been taking place in the organisation. And that is the way in which I think we can best support the rest of the system, we can support providers, and we can ensure that we maintain the focus on the local population that we have. I think the other thing has been the extent to which we have been able to support providers and colleagues across the system. And as we have then had to, if you like, get back to business as usual, which has been an enormous challenge over the last couple of months, having stopped an awful lot of activity in the first part of the pandemic, having to ensure that we now start to turn back on all of those operations and appointments, particularly in the acute trusts and in general practice, so that people can start to be seen again and we can start to address some of the backlog that's built up. It's been incredibly important that we have done that collectively, and we've been able to support the system in how we plan and coordinate some of that activity, whilst also planning for some of the challenges we face going forward into winter. And it's very much that sense of working as a system by default. it's a bit jargony kind of system by default, but essentially this is about recognizing that as a system we have to start taking shared accountability and responsibility for the services that we deliver and the outcomes that our population can achieve. So if we go to the next slide, this really was just intended to highlight that broader work that we're doing within the system as part of the integrated care system. Andrew has already talked about the fact that we became the first integrated care system in London in June last year. I think that's something we should be very proud of, and I would particularly want to call out Andrew's leadership through that process in allowing us to achieve that, because actually it took a huge amount of work to think about how we brought partners together and how we ensured we have quite a deep partnership that isn't just about the relationships we would typically have with acute providers, but actually is also about ensuring that local authority colleagues are very much a part of the ICS. It's been the biggest challenge, I think, in integrated care systems across the country, but South East London is exemplary from my point of view in the extent to which it has enabled us to involve boroughs and elected members in this process, because part of this has to be not just about how we work as a commissioning organisation, but how we enhance the amount of democratic accountability that we have within boroughs as well. So it's been really important that we've made progress in that way, and I'm very proud of the fact that we were able to do that, and that we're able to think about now how we deliver care to the 1.9 million people who live in South East London, but we do so in a way that reflects those very local needs, as well as the broader challenges that there are in delivering care services. We've set out on this some of the priorities. People will be aware of those that we have as an integrated care system, joining up the services that exist outside of the hospital, so that we can really think about the pathways of care that patients experience, and how we can ensure that we, as part of that, reduce some of the pressure on our acute trusts, particularly in the emergency departments, and how we think about improving people's experience of outpatients and care that's planned, how we can think quite differently to ensure that people have the care that they need, but we can provide that collaboratively across those pathways. How we think about long-term conditions, which we know drive so many inequalities within our local communities, and how we can do all of that within the resources we have available to us. And we're very much thinking about that collectively. I suppose what I would say finally in relation to the integrated care system is that the response to the pandemic has undoubtedly stressed relationships, but I think that it is the stress within those relationships that has allowed us to strengthen the relationships going forward. So having to deal with really significant challenges collectively is what I think will place us in a stronger position going forward. And when I think about the mutual aid that there has been between acute providers, between practices, across different services, I think one of the things that has emerged over the last few months, and I hope we will continue to build on, is that relationships are undoubtedly getting stronger across South East London. And that has been partly because we've had to come together to respond to the pandemic. So really important that we now start to think about how the progress we've made is sort of enshrined within a kind of governance structure that reflects the sorts of functions I've talked about shared accountability, delivering improvements in integration and service delivery, and meeting our financial obligations. So we're currently doing some work across the ICS to set up and refresh the governance that we have collectively, and that should be established for October. So the final slide that I just wanted to share was really around the sort of challenges that we face going forward, and many of these have already been alluded to. We are undoubtedly going to face continued pressure in relation to the pandemic, and we will talk a lot more about this in the governing body meeting following this, but our continued response to that is going to be really important. And I guess most challenging will be continuing to respond to the pandemic whilst maintaining a lot of what we do in terms of business as usual. So ensuring that actually people can continue to have their operations, their elective procedures, their outpatient appointments throughout this period wherever possible, so that we ensure that we also manage to reduce some of the backlog that developed over the initial response to the pandemic. So we need to be doing both going forward, and that is going to be a huge pressure on the system. What we also know from the first phase of the pandemic is that it's drawn really, from my point of view, important attention to the inequalities that exist across our communities. It's always clearly been an ambition of this organisation to reduce inequalities. What we know from the initial response to the pandemic is it has undoubtedly not just surfaced and exposed some of the inequalities that exist, but it has exacerbated some of them as well. And so as a group, as the governing body and as an organisation, this is an absolute priority for us going forward. And importantly, what I've heard consistently from the governing body is that this can't be about fine words, this has to be about action. So again, this will be discussed on the governing body meeting this afternoon, but a set of really explicit actions that we need to take to start to address some of this. The financial challenge, Usman has demonstrated what a fantastic finance team and leadership we have in South East London, but they are going to be put to the test significantly, I think, over the coming year to ensure that we can achieve not just financial balance as a CCG, but that actually we collectively need to do that as an integrated care system. And I know that Usman's been supporting that work across all of the partners in South East London. In addition, I think I just wanted to sort of end on the importance of collaboration. Andrew rightly said we've made huge progress, I think, in terms of our relationships. I think the pandemic has in many ways helped and enabled that. But it is unsurprising that at times tensions exist between partners within the system. And we have a journey yet to travel, I think, in terms of making progress towards sort of absolute kind of shared accountability and collaborative working across South East London. But the progress has been really quite striking. And again, I would point to some of the work between the acute providers, but also to the work that's been happening in practices and PCNs and with other community providers. We are really starting now to see the benefits of collaboration and how that could really make a difference to patient care going forward. So it continues to be a challenge, but it's something that I hope very much we will prioritise over the coming year. So on that note, I would just want to also share my thanks for the fantastic work that staff in the CCG have done, the resilience and the agility, the flexibility of the organisation in responding to the pandemic, in establishing a new organisation and doing so in a fantastically powerful way, connecting into local areas as well as managing to maintain the relationships that we have with other providers has been incredibly important. And in part that is because of the relationships we have with other providers, and I would want to thank them as well for all the work that they're doing on the front line, whether in mental health, community services, social care, or on the acute side of the system. And of course the work the voluntary and community sector have been doing to support some of our most vulnerable patients during this time. So huge thanks across the system for the work that's been happening, and to the staff and to the leadership and the governing body of the CCG. What I didn't mention earlier was that in terms of our development, we spent a lot of time thinking about our vision and our values as an organisation, and the leadership that we have within this organisation is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm hugely appreciative of the work that Andrew does. I'm also hugely appreciative of the governing body and the work that that they have been doing in establishing the new CCG. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Christina just to help us orchestrate some of the questions that have come in. So Christina, I've just been presenting, so I'm just having a quick look to see what's come in. Do you want to help us with this process?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who has been watching and to those of you who have shared a question. The first one, Usman, I wondered whether you could just comment. There's been a question just in terms of if people wanted to access a bit more information, for example, on the annual accounts, how they would go about doing that.
Thanks, Christina. So for anybody who is interested in reading our accounts, if you go to the South East London CCG website, just because our predecessor organisation websites are now closed or not live, on the South East London CCG website, under publications, you will see annual reports for all 6 previous CCGs, and the annual accounts are within those annual reports. So they're all fully there and published for anyone to access.
Brilliant. Thanks, Usman. Hopefully that answered the question that was asked. The next one, Andrew wondered whether you could comment. This is a question from Nicola Kingston, who was asking when will the public start to be able to be involved in discussions on the governance of the ICS? COVID's shown that local people and communities should be seen as full partners in this process.
Thank you, Christina. I agree with the last point made there. I'd only say that I think it's amplified that point. I think that has always been the case and never more so now. So would I sort of be on record as saying that? Secondly, I think it is fair to say that through COVID, and Jonty made some reference to system by default and the future roles for ICSs, I think it's fair to say that some months have been lost. So I think I recall Amanda Pritchard in her new role then as a National Chief Operating Officer had published some intentions to how ICSs might look, and they would come to fruition around about April, and of course the pandemic ensued. So that work is still to be completed, and in that sense we are taking an iterative approach to our governance that essentially is recognising the fact that our ICS isn't a statutory body but a partnership of bodies, and we are seeking to involve our public and citizens through those. So I guess the change at the moment, and one that I guess is live, Christina, you may want to say something about this at the moment, is through our borough-based boards at a local level. And then as a CCG, we've been seeing the CCG as a conduit for some of those considerations and discussions until such time as we have a greater sight of ICS governance and working. That said, we currently have different arrangements for South East London's ICS leadership. Effectively, we stood down anything other than a recovery response, and we'll be looking to stand back up some of those OSEL arrangements as we get closer to Christmas. And in doing so, that will not be a case of a static position. So we'll look to stand up our partnership board. That's a requirement of all integrated care systems, but embark on an ongoing conversation about how we iterate those arrangements, including with the public over time. As for when we see a next national statement on ICSs, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. So I hope that is helpful in response.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I don't know if any other other colleagues in the governing body might perhaps want to comment, but you did mention, of course, borough-based boards and what local boroughs are doing. And as part of the recovery planning work, there's been a huge amount of work being done with partners, but also a lot of the information and recovery plans are being shared more publicly for comment. So certainly echo that working with patients and public is hugely important and part of this process already. I don't know, Joy, if you wanted to comment from a broader sort of public patient engagement perspective.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm just turning on my video and microphone. It's a little bit of a delay. Thank you very much, Nicola, for your question, and thank you for your involvement in much of the work we have been doing in the CCG about engagement with the public. Your contributions are always very worthwhile. I think we are standing up an engagement assurance committee in the CCG, and you know about the work that we've been doing in that. And with our partner organisations, there's a lot of work going on sharing information across the partner organisations. And I'm absolutely sure that when Andrew says about this will be one of the things that absolutely needs to be at the forefront in the ICS, I absolutely agree with that. And I will be leading some of the, not leading, but certainly playing an important part, hopefully, in some of the work going forward.
Thanks so much, Joy. We had a third question, if it's okay to move on to that, and this is about technology and access. Many of the patients are still having problems accessing GPs because of technology now in place, and e-consult has been mentioned. The question is this going to change? I don't know if you would like to take that question.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, sure. And just before that, I think sort of a reflection on the conversation we've just been having in terms of public involvement and engagement. I think it's a personal reflection really, but very often we do get quite lost in the kind of governance element of that. I've just been involved in a piece of work across London involving London, in fact, two pieces of work that both involved a deliberative process, one where we were bringing people together to think about data sharing, and another then where we were bringing people together, citizens from across London, to think about some of the changes that we've made as a result of COVID. And I think the lesson that I have learned from that is that how we go about this needs to be far less about where we locate people within our governance and far more about how we establish processes where we can really involve people, we can get an absolute diversity of view and perspective, and that can inform the work that we do. And I've certainly found some of these deliberative processes where people have been able to explore quite complex issues and been able to really guide and advise policy and decision making has been critical. So I think there's a lot that we can do, and it doesn't just locate itself, as it were, within the kind of governance that we need to establish, although of course that does give us a framework that ensures that those views can inform the work that we do going forward. So I wanted to flag that because from my point of view, I think that's going to be critical, and that's why those local borough conversations are so important, because they get that depth and that breadth that we need to inform the work we do in South East London. I think so. In terms of the challenges that are being described in relation to accessing general practice, I guess there are probably a couple of things that it's worth saying. Undoubtedly, as a result of the pandemic, we know that people were very anxious about going into practices. So from quite early on, we know that people were avoiding seeking medical advice and attention. We also know that for staff, some of whom are vulnerable and at risk, it was helpful to be able to, where we could, ensure that people could initially have a conversation over the telephone or online. That was not to replace face-to-face consultations. It never has replaced face-to-face consultations, and it should never replace face-to-face consultations. It's really important that people can still be seen and examined, and that as clinicians, we can really ensure that we are undertaking a very thorough consultation, and that we don't in any way limit our ability to fulfill our role. However, as part of the pandemic response, I think it will continue to be important that people have conversations virtually, sometimes in the first instance, whether that is through 111 or whether that's with general practice, mostly because it's often possible to help people or direct them or ensure that they achieve access to the care that they need in that way, without necessarily having to see people face to face. But where it is important to see people face to face, we will absolutely do that. And in fact, people may be aware, we established a campaign across practices in South East London, where a range of different clinicians across all of the practices had a campaign to encourage people to say general practice is open for business, and I was really proud of South East London practices for coming together and making it very clear that we were absolutely going to continue to do that. I think there's a slightly separate question around the sort of technology that we are implementing here. So there's something about how do we support people at a distance and then make some decisions about whether they need to be seen face to face or they need to see somebody else. But then there's something about the sort of technology. And I suppose some of the feedback we have had is that it can feel as though the technology that's being used gets in the way of people being able to access their GP. And I completely recognise that for some people, completing a form to describe what's wrong that then goes to the GP doesn't feel as though that is the easiest way to access a practice compared to perhaps just having a conversation on the telephone. What we need to do is to ensure that That is never the only way to do it. So I cannot tell you that that particular digital products like the one that's been mentioned are going to not be used in the future, but they need to be used alongside a number of other ways of being able to access care and support going forward, because there are also a number of people in the population who have really appreciated the change. I've spoken to an enormous number of patients who've said, actually, the fact that I could be at work, I could book a time to speak to somebody, to have a conversation over the video. All of these have been really, really important sort of opportunities for some patients. But what we mustn't do is to enhance any of our inequalities by limiting access for those who aren't as confident digitally as they could be. So, sorry, slightly long-winded answer. And I think it's about the fact that we do need to continue during the pandemic to have this virtual access in the first instance, but that we need to ensure there are face-to-face appointments available, and they are increasing across South East London as we speak. But we do need to look at the sort of technology and make sure that that doesn't prove a barrier to people accessing care. Is that okay, Christina?
That is great. Thank you so much, Jonty. We have had another question come in whilst we've been speaking just about flu vaccinations and availability of vaccinations and cohorts. I'll mention this, and others might want to come in as well. So in terms of availability of flu vaccines, clearly there is a huge demand and need to vaccinate as many people as possible this year. Orders have been made across South East London and across London, and deliveries are coming through in September for the programme to launch in October. So we hope to be able to do that, and we haven't had practices reporting significant concerns at the moment. There are additional cohorts this year, over 50s as mentioned in the question, and that is absolutely an expected additional cohort. At that later in the programme, we're expecting that would be confirmed and additional supplies would be released at that point. And we will be talking probably more about that in the governing body as well. I'll pause in case any other colleagues want to come in on that question. Otherwise, I think we have time for one more. I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, fine. So then there is another question, I think, which builds on the engagement question from earlier, and I was going to come back to Joy to touch on this, although again, this is a topic I'm sure that we will speak about more in the governing body if viewers would like to join us there. So the person who asked the question has said that there haven't been formal engagement groups active at the CCG in this financial year, conscious that previous arrangements were stood down. The question is, should interim arrangements be put in place and pending the new structures coming into effect?
Hi, thank you, and thank you very much for the question. Just to give a bit of a recap on the engagement that has been happening, members of the public and certainly members of the CCG will remember during January and February and the early part of March, we were talking about an approach to engagement. And we were circulating a lot of contacts in all our boroughs about how we ought to engage with our public as a new CCG. And we ended up, just before COVID struck us, with a menu really of suggestions that we were beginning to work through. And then COVID struck and we had to pause the work that we were doing on that. And in fact, engagement was paused very much, as you've heard during Andrew's review of what was happening and the work that the borough's staff had to do. We've gradually been standing up engagement again, and since June we've run 4 task and finish groups with members of the public drawn from across the 6 boroughs. And I was trying to add up how many hours we have spent on these, but we've had 4 task and finish groups. The first one we did was on recovery from COVID, and then we did 2 on digital engagement and 1 on non-digital engagement. And that was really to find out how we could engage with members of the public in the COVID environment. And those 2 task and finish groups complemented each other. And the last group that we set up was the Engagement Assurance Committee. And this was because we wanted a lot of input from members of the public about how we can assure the CCG about the engagement that's taking place. Now, the COVID task and finish group, I think we had about 4 meetings. The digital and the non-digital, we've had about 6, I think, of each. Some of them were joint. And the Engagement Assurance Committee, we had our last one this morning, and I think that was the 9th or the 10th meeting of that committee. And it's been really, really helpful for members of the public giving their views and their input into just how we can engage with members of the public. If people listen to the governing body meeting this afternoon, you will see there's a set of principles that have been put together. And those are how we can engage with people during COVID in a digital and a non-digital way. And those complement each other because we do need to work out how we can talk to people and how we can engage people that we need to be talking to. I can go into that in some more detail at the governing body meeting this afternoon when we're looking at the principles, if that's helpful. But it has been really, really helpful and really beneficial, and it will help our work going forward and the task and finish groups that we have held.
Thanks so much for that, Joy. In terms of just a flavour of some of the things that have been happening in the boroughs and reasons for the change, I wanted Martin Wilkinson from Lewisham. Did you want to just comment as just an example of Lewisham situation?
Yeah, just as a follow-up really to what Joy said, and just give it an example of Lewisham. So we have a patient reference group which has continued to meet, albeit not as frequently and virtually, and we have been talking about our recovery plans, for example. So we have had some, I accept that things have scaled back slightly on arrangements, but we have continued our arrangements. We've also been working closely with our lay member in our borough-based board and with Healthwatch, and Healthwatch have run sort of a survey, if you like, online again, and surveyed people's experiences, which we've then taken into account as part of our recovery plan. And we're now going around talking to specific groups. So we've met with a disability group recently, talking about our recovery plans and the priorities. So I think we are getting back out there, if you like, in terms of the CCG, certainly in Lewisham, but it's not fair to say that we disbanded everything. And I think those arrangements are probably similar in other boroughs.
Thanks, Martin and Christina. Thank you so much for having kind of choreographed the questions. One of the things I'm finding quite challenging in the new world as the chair is to be juggling sort of questions and videos and speaking and presentations and all the rest of it. So I really appreciate your help in ensuring that we are responsive to those. And I guess from that point of view, I wanted to bring this to a close. I did just want to once again reiterate thanks to the whole team and to all of the staff and partners. But I also wanted to thank those of you who are watching this and the public more broadly, because actually there was a phenomenal response to the first part of the pandemic. There continues to be huge support for the work that we're doing. It has been a really difficult time across health and social care. It's been a really difficult time for people in their personal lives. And this has put huge stress and strain on our population as a whole. And I think the way in which people have responded to this and contributed to the care that so many of our population need has been absolutely fantastic. And I wanted to say thank you to everybody who's watching as well for those efforts and for their continuing efforts in helping us to tackle the pandemic going forward. So on that note, I'm going to bring the AGM to a close, but we would really welcome those of you who would like to join us in half an hour's time for our meeting in public, and we will be picking up on a number of the issues that we've just been discussing, including flu, including engagement, including inequalities. So we have a number of items on the agenda coming up that I think will feel deeply relevant to the conversation we've just been having. So on that note, thank you all very much indeed for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in half an hour. But I hope this has been a useful and helpful update for you. Thank you.